All right, ready to get into some serious history. Today, we're going to deep dive into the road to World War One, and you sent in some really interesting History.com excerpts about its outbreak. I mean, we all learned about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in school. It's like the big story, right? But was that really the cause? I have a feeling we're going to find out it's a lot more complicated than that.
You're absolutely right. It's way more than just one event. What's interesting is that the History.com article points all the way back to the Congress of Vienna.
Okay, back up. Congress of Vienna.
Yeah, like almost a century before 1914. They're using that as like a starting point. It was this massive attempt to create lasting peace in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars.
Right, right. Napoleonic Wars, got it.
But even then, it seems like the cracks were already starting to show.
Mm-hmm.
Like peace was fragile.
So rewind to 1815, Congress of Vienna. For those of us who maybe slept through that history class, what was the point of that whole thing?
Basically, it was a huge peace conference. Like, imagine all the major powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, all in one room, trying to figure out how to prevent another massive war across the entire continent.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it was. They had to redraw the map of Europe, come up with a new balance of power, basically make sure no one country could just dominate everyone else and threaten the peace.
Kind of like a giant game of Risk, but with real countries and real consequences.
Exactly. And for a while, it actually worked. The Congress of Vienna did manage to prevent any huge wars for a while, but the seeds of future conflict, well, they were already there. Especially in this one place, this really unstable region, the Balkan Peninsula.
Ah, yes. The Balkans. The article calls it a powder keg.
For good reason. See, it was formerly Ottoman territory, and by the late 1800s, it was like everyone wanted a piece of it, especially Austria, Hungary, and Russia. They were constantly bumping heads.
Okay, so why all the tension in the Balkans specifically? It seems like a lot of empires had their eyes on that region.
It was all about power, really. You have the Ottoman Empire declining, which leaves this power vacuum, and everyone's scrambling to fill it. Austria-Hungary, this kind of aging empire that's desperate to hold onto its power, saw the Balkans as a way to, expand their influence and stay relevant. But then you've got Russia on the other side. They felt this like cultural and religious connection to the Slavic people in the Balkans, saw themselves as their protectors. So you have these two empires with completely clashing ambitions. Plus, there was a long history of ethnic and religious tensions in the Balkans already. It was like a recipe for disaster.
And then, to make things even spicier, Austria-Hungary decides to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, and Serbia is furious, seeing Bosnia as part of their territory. It seems like Austria-Hungary just threw a match onto that powder keg. What were they thinking?
Well, it wasn't just about the land itself. Austria-Hungary was this big multi-ethnic empire. Let's be honest, they were struggling to keep it all together. Annexing Bosnia was a way for them to try and look strong, Project Power, hold their crumbling empire together. But obviously, it backfired big time.
Yeah, no kidding.
It basically just poured gasoline on the fire. Serbia saw it as a direct threat to their own plans in the region, and it made everyone in the Balkans even more nationalistic. Tensions were sky high.
Okay, so we've got this powder keg region, power-hungry empires, and now a major provocation. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, right. And then, on top of all of that, we have these pre-existing alliances, right? The article talks about Russia and France teaming up because they're both worried about Germany's power growing. And then you've got Great Britain trying to keep things balanced because they're worried about Germany's navy. Help me out here. How do these alliances turn what should be a regional conflict into, well, a world war?
Think of it this way. Those alliances were like a bunch of tripwires. One nation goes to war, and suddenly all their allies are obligated to jump in too. It's like a chain reaction. It created this situation where even a small conflict could, explode out of control.
They lure everyone in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of just like some border skirmishes, you suddenly have the potential for a war that spans the entire continent. And, well, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's like these alliances were just waiting for some spark to set them off. And tragically, that spark ends up being an assassination.
Right, but the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, it wasn't just some random event. To really get why it had such a huge impact, we need to look at the context.
Yeah.
Like what was going on at the time.
Well, the article talks about how Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were touring Sarajevo in an open car, and get this, the security was super lax. I mean, they were driving around in the middle of this incredibly tense region with hardly any protection. It just seems crazy in hindsight.
It does, doesn't it? And it really shows how people were, I don't know, maybe underestimating the threat level at the time. It's important to remember that the assassin, Gavrilo Princip, was only 19 years old.
Wow, 19.
Yeah, and he was a member of this group, the Young Bosnia Movement. They, along with another group called the Black Hand, which was a Serbian terrorist organization, they basically wanted to, free the South Slavs from Austro-Hungarian rule and create this, unified Yugoslavia. So they saw Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, as a symbol of oppression, I guess.
So for Princip and those groups, this visit to Sarajevo was their chance to make a statement. A horrific one, obviously, but it definitely wasn't just some random act of violence. It was tied to all the political stuff happening at the time.
Exactly. And it really shook Europe. Austria-Hungary felt incredibly humiliated. They felt like they had to respond and respond forcefully. But the problem was they knew they couldn't risk going to war with Russia without Germany backing them up.
And of course, Germany gave Austria-Hungary that backing, basically gave them a blank check to deal with Serbia.
Yeah, and that basically gave Austria-Hungary the confidence to issue this, really harsh ultimatum to Serbia. They demanded that Serbia stop all anti-Austrian stuff, allow Austria-Hungary to come in and investigate the assassination, and basically just give up a huge amount of their independence.
Reading about those demands, it almost feels like the ultimatum was designed to be rejected, like they were trying to start a war no matter what.
Yeah, you're definitely picking up on something there. A lot of historians believe Austria-Hungary made those demands so harsh on purpose. They saw this as an opportunity to finally assert their control in the Balkans, even if it meant risking a bigger war.
So Serbia, stuck between a rock and a hard place, turns to Russia for help. And Russia, who's been worried about Germany trying to take over the Balkans, starts mobilizing their army. Can you explain what that meant back then? Mobilization, it seems like more than just calling up the troops.
Oh yeah, mobilization back then was a huge undertaking. It wasn't just about getting soldiers ready, it was about moving massive amounts of people and equipment and supplies, getting them all into position. Basically, it was putting the entire country on a war footing. And in the super tense atmosphere of Europe at the time, mobilization was seen as a direct threat, like you're about to attack. Once it started, it was almost impossible to stop.
So Russia mobilizes, and that's when all those tripwires we talked about, all those alliances, they start getting triggered. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Germany declares war on Russia, and then because of their alliance, Germany also declares war on France. But what about Great Britain? Weren't they on the sidelines of all this Balkan stuff at first?
They were. But the thing is, Germany's plan to attack France involved going through Belgium, which was a neutral country. And Britain had promised to protect Belgium's neutrality, so when Germany invaded, Britain was pulled into the war too.
So this regional conflict over, territories and influence in the Balkans suddenly explodes into a full-blown world war. It's just incredible and kind of terrifying how quickly it all happened.
And the world was forever changed by what happened next. I mean, the article mentions over 20 million soldiers killed, millions more wounded, and then you have this global influenza pandemic that was made even worse because of the war. It's hard to really grasp how much devastation came out of it.
It really is. And it wasn't just about the war itself, right? The article also talks about all the political upheaval that came after. Empires collapsed: Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. And in Russia, the war actually helped pave the way for the Bolshevik Revolution. Plus, you have the Treaty of Versailles, which was supposed to create peace, but, maybe it actually created more problems.
Yeah, and the Treaty of Versailles is a really interesting example of how, even when you're trying to make peace, you can end up with a lot of unintended consequences. It punished Germany really harshly, huge reparations, territorial losses, all that really just created this deep resentment and instability. And it didn't really address the nationalism and ethnic tensions that helped cause the war in the first place.
So all those unresolved issues from World War I, the bitterness, the economic problems, the desire for revenge, all that stuff, basically just set the stage for World War II just 20 years later.
Absolutely. A lot of historians actually see World War II as a continuation of World War I. The seeds of that second global conflict were planted right in the ashes of the first one. The Treaty of Versailles, even though it was trying to create peace, actually ended up creating the conditions that made another war more likely. And then you have these extremist ideologies like Nazism that thrived in all that chaos and resentment in post-war Germany. It was like a perfect storm for another global catastrophe.
It really makes you think about history, doesn't it? It's not just a bunch of random events. It's this complex chain reaction. And sometimes even trying to create peace can backfire in really tragic ways.
Wow, it really is a lot to process, right?
Mm.
This whole deep dive has taken us from a peace conference in 1815 all the way to a world war in 1914, and then all the ripple effects that led to another world war just 20 years later. I mean, could this have all been avoided? Was there like a turning point where things could have gone differently?
That's the big question, isn't it? The one that historians have been arguing about for over a century.
Uh,
Some people think that if Austria-Hungary hadn't, overreacted to the assassination so strongly, or maybe if Germany hadn't given them that blank check, maybe things would have stayed contained.
yeah.
But other historians think that with the alliance system being as rigid as it was, a bigger war was almost inevitable. It's hard to say for sure. It's like this giant what if hanging over history. Like if those people back then could have seen how their actions would lead to so much destruction, would they have made different choices? You know? It makes you think.
It really does. It's impossible to know, obviously, but what we can do is learn from it all. By looking at the different factors that led to World War I, all the political stuff, the cultural tensions, the choices that key people made, we can start to understand how these big conflicts get out of control. And maybe, hopefully, figure out how to prevent them in the future.
So, to be clear, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was like the spark, but it wasn't the only cause. This deep dive has shown us that it was years and years of tensions bubbling under the surface, all these power struggles and miscalculations that finally boiled over. It's a good reminder that history isn't just dates and battles in textbooks. It's about the choices that real people made and the consequences that followed.
And it reminds us that history isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It's connected to everything. Like, the decisions that were made over a century ago still shape the world we live in now.
Well said. This has been a really fascinating deep dive into the events that led up to World War I. We've uncovered this tangled web of alliances, ambition, and mistakes that caused one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. And for everyone listening, what were your takeaways? What really stood out to you in this deep dive? What parts of World War I are you still wondering about? What other what ifs are you thinking about? Let us know. Keep those brains buzzing, and until next time, happy exploring.